We have spent a lot of time talking about civil liberties. And keep in mind that civil liberties belong to you, the individual person, and that civil liberties every time limit the power of the government. They prevent the government from doing something to you. Now we're going to shift over and talk about civil rights. And so we will be dealing with a lot of things that you guys remember from history class, a lot of important people, and a lot of work that they've done to make sure that people are treated equally. And that's what civil rights will be all about. It'll be about making sure that groups of people are treated equally. Here we see Martin Luther King being arrested. This is in Birmingham. One of the documents that we will focus on this unit is his letter from the Birmingham jail. But first, we couldn't do anything without our objective. So let's focus on this objective for a second. We're going to describe the development of civil rights policy. And today we're going to focus mostly on African Americans. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s achieved a lot of important policy goals. And those achievements will end up impacting all of the rest of the groups that we spend time looking at. So we are going to kind of isolate the work of the African American civil rights movement first. And what we want to be able to do, we want to explain the impact of social movements on equal protection of the law. So we'll be focusing a lot on that equal protection clause. So we will be trying to figure out what kind of civil rights issues have impacted African Americans, what the court has said about those things, what Congress has said about those issues, and how the government has responded. First, we'll focus on civil rights. We want to make sure that we understand what this is before we move forward. So we'll get a good definition of civil rights and talk about the issues involved there. Here we have a march this is from Memphis. This is during the sanitation strike in the 1960s. And so this will give us a good example of a social movement and how it can impact civil rights protections. We're going to start civil rights exactly where we started civil liberties. We're going to go right to the 14th Amendment. So we'd gone through all of the 14th Amendment before, talking about the citizenship aspects and all of that stuff. Remember, the 14th Amendment was passed right after the Civil War, was intended to grant citizenship to people that had been enslaved. And what we're going to deal with in the 14th Amendment moving forward, the civil liberty stuff really focuses on the due process clause, and now we're going to focus more on the equal protection clause. So remember those two clauses in the 14th Amendment. The equal protection clause forces the state governments to treat all citizens equally, regardless of their race. The due process clause forces the state governments to protect all individuals' life, liberty, and property rights. So all this is included in the 14th Amendment, and we want to spend the rest of our time in this unit focusing on the Equal Protection Clause. So the Equal Protection Clause says all citizens must be treated equally. Now, it's a little more complicated than that because the law does not actually treat every group of people equally the same all the time. So we're going to talk in civil rights, we're going to talk about classifications, like how the government is going to classify citizens into different groups of people and sometimes differentiate in treating those groups a certain way. So we're going to use the word discrimination and not always act like that is an inherently bad thing, but we mean that the government is classifying people into groups and treating them differently based on which group they're in. So we have 3 different levels of scrutiny for doing this. And we'll start with race and ethnicity. That's what we're going to focus on today. And race and ethnicity has to undergo strict scrutiny. This means that if there is a law that treats racial or ethnic groups differently, we're going to assume it's wrong, and the government is going to have a very hard time justifying that. With gender, we have what we call intermediate scrutiny. It's still hard to justify, but there are some reasons, there are some policies out there that treat men and women differently, and that's okay. So classifying people and treating them differently by gender, not necessarily automatically bad. Doing that with race probably is, although it is possible for the government to show that there's a reason for doing that. And then we have some other groups like age groups or wealth groups or whatever. And these are easy to justify. Think about all of the ways that you and I are treated differently because of the law. I am a 1,000-year-old man, so I have a variety of rights and abilities that you don't have because of your age group. Same would be true of like our income groups. Like I make more money than you do at the moment, and so when it's tax time this spring, I'm going to have to abide by a different set of policies than you are. And so with some classifications of groups of people, it's totally okay to treat them differently. So the government will classify people in a variety of ways, and in most cases, we're just going to treat everyone equally and not think about it. But sometimes there is a legitimate government purpose for the government to treat groups of people differently, and that's what we'll be dealing with. So the classification of people needs to be related to a legitimate government purpose, and this is where we might decide that some versions of discrimination are valid, right? So for example, I am allowed to purchase alcohol because of my rapidly advancing age, and you are too young to purchase alcohol. So that's normal, that's common, that the government has a legitimate purpose in doing so. And so age discrimination is the kind of thing that's generally going to be acceptable. In gender discrimination, we have some forms of gender discrimination. And by discrimination, again, we just say that the government is treating people in different ways, not necessarily harming a person. But there is, in some school situations, men and women are treated differently. In some military situations, men and women are treated differently. There's a variety of other things here. And as long as the government can justify a legitimate purpose for doing so, this is going to be accepted more often. Not nearly as often as something like age discrimination, but more often than like racial discrimination. And so with racial discrimination, this is the hardest one for the state to justify. If the state is going to treat groups of people differently based on their race, then they need to be able to explain their purpose in doing so. They're going to have to justify that treatment. And so one of the ways where we see that, and what we'll end up talking about today, is affirmative action programs. So programs that might treat racial groups a little differently in terms of like college admissions or hiring and firing can be justified by the state. All right, now we know what civil rights means. We know what civil rights are, and we know that like we're talking about the treatment of groups of people, making sure that the groups are treated equally, but in some cases, we will still allow some forms of different treatment for groups. So now we're going to move forward and focus solely today on African Americans and the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s to see what type of legislative and judicial actions they were able to achieve and to advance the protections of civil rights.